Howdy, folks. Welcome back to another special episode of the Texas SignalCast. I'm your host, Joe Deshotel, and I'm here with my co-host today, David Leffler. How you doing, David?
What's up, Joe? I'm doing great today.
Good, good. Well, we are going to be talking about what happened with SB 7, the voter suppression bill that died in the Texas House when Democrats walked out and broke the quorum late the other night. So you've been following this, David. We've talked a little bit about SB7 before and about how bad it is. We've certainly been covering a lot of this on the texassignal.com. Do you have any initial thoughts about what took place?
Yeah, I just really thought that Briscoe had this in him. I thought he'd be able to. I'm kidding. No. Yeah, it was a bit of a surprise for me and as for most people. I know we can get into some of the rumors you had heard the day before about this may be happening, but it was exciting. It was invigorating to know that there was going to be some level of pushback from Democrats, because many of us were sitting here just kind of watching the Twitter timeline roll down, kind of like a slow march to death, with that anticipated bill being set in, and obviously all of the voting rights that would be stripped away kind of all at once.
Yeah, exactly. And so just to kind of recap what was in SB7 that was so bad. I mean, there was a lot. It was a pretty big bill. In fact, they had initially referred to it as an omnibus voting bill, omnibus meaning just like a catch-all for a lot of different elements. Interestingly and ironically, there were several typos throughout the process, and one of the typos was instead of omnibus bill, they had ominous bill. And I think that was a little more accurate for what this was. And so the bill essentially it did a lot of different things, and it targeted people of color very heavily. Now Republicans claim that wasn't true, but if you actually look at the elements of the bill that it changed, it absolutely did. One of those that got a lot of attention was what it did to Harris County. If we remember, Harris County did a lot of innovative things like drive-through voting, overnight voting for people who worked late, and the bill would have eliminated those two innovations as in addition to limiting how many polling locations can be used countywide for certain counties, and those counties that they limited it to were large counties. So we're talking about counties that have large populations of people of color and large Democratic votes. So talking Harris County, Dallas County, Travis County, Bexar County, even Tarrant County now, which is actually in 2020 turned blue after the votes were completely counted. I don't know if you were watching that night, the election night, but it was red literally up until a few days later when they counted every last vote. It just ticked over to the blue column. And so they're seeing this happen, in Tarrant County has been sort of a bellwether for the whole state of Texas. In fact, if you go back historically, it has been within less than 1%, about 0.5%, of the statewide vote total. And so whatever the vote total, Democrat versus Republican in Tarrant County, reflected statewide within 0.5 point. And so when Republicans look at a bellwether county like that and they start to see, oh man, we're losing ground, we've got to really make some changes to how people can vote. And certainly they did with this. It made lots of changes from what you can do in terms of voting early, in terms of limiting hours. It changed how you actually could vote by mail and who could vote by mail. So just a lot of different things. And so, I think today we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the strategy that took place and like what actually happened, why they had to resort to this, and what really led to this being the strategy they took as opposed to some of the others. Because typically we were getting into the last day of the session, of course. And so you start to run out of options, but the rules are really the only thing Democrats have, right? And so whenever the Senate basically started changing the rules, because the Senate's rules are, let's say, more flexible because they can kind of choose when to suspend those rules. And because they saw Democrats basically really putting up a fight on SB7, they essentially decided to suspend their rules to take up this SB7 bill earlier than they would otherwise by the rules, so that Democrats would not have the time to kill the bill, because at the end of the session, it's all about time and running out of
Mhm.
time. And so Democrats had essentially lined up enough Democrats to speak out on this bill that would essentially run out the clock. Senators Dan Patrick, who leads the Senate, essentially suspended the rules to take this up early. And not only did they do that, but they made additional changes. And so, if you'll remember, essentially what happened, if you can remember back over the last few weeks how this is rolled out, you mentioned Briscoe Cain, the chair of the House Elections Committee. Basically, they gutted the House bill, and they essentially took SB7, which is the Senate version of the bill, and they put sort of the House bill into the Senate bill as a shell, and they were trying to move that forward. Now, what happens is when the House passes a version and the Senate passes a version, they each chamber appoints a couple of members to what's called a conference committee. That conference committee takes both versions of the bill and they make one version that they can send back for final approval. Now, what happened was they essentially, the conference committee did come to an agreement on a bill. They've definitely considered a very bad bill, but it made some improvements to the original bill.
Mhm.
And so Democrats were going to still vote against it, but they were at least in a position where they could say, we improved this bill. This bill's not quite as bad as it was. And then what happened at the last second after the conference committee met, the Senate essentially added a lot of changes after the conference committee had already agreed on what was going to be there. They added a bunch of different changes that made the bill much worse. And we can talk about a couple of the details of what that is. But essentially, what happened was these changes were completely unacceptable to Democrats. And basically, as it became clear that they were going to push this even worse bill through without even taking debate, without even taking questions from Democrats, because they knew that the more questions they took, the closer they got to the end, the higher the chance Democrats could kill this bill altogether. And so they stopped taking questions. Democrats have points of order lined up, which I don't know if we've discussed points of order, but a point of order is essentially a mistake in the bill that essentially kills the bill. So if some, it's a very technical thing,
Mhm.
and so it's not usually about the content of the policy change that the bill presents, but it's much more of a technical issue about the way the bill was laid out and in accordance to the rules and the way it's supposed to be. So it's a procedural move that can kill a bill. And so Republicans, of course, wanted to avoid all of that and just push this through. And so when that became clear that that was going to happen, then Democrats sort of started trickling out, and eventually there was no quorum. And so in the Texas House, you need 100 members present for a quorum. Democrats have almost 70 members. They have like 67 or 68 or something like that members. And so as long as 51 members were not present in the House at the time, they could not take a vote. And so that's essentially what happened when it became clear that there would be no more debate on SB7 or the changes. And there were, again, typos, the last second changes that made the bill worse. Democrats decided our only option to kill this bill is to just walk out and not be present.
And for anyone who's watching or listening, if you don't realize by now, Joe here is the Texas Signal's resident parliamentarian. He is the one who can help make this a lot easier for us. And just to point out, there were things in this bill that the Republicans have since tried to claim were typos that actually weren't, right. One of the provisions was changing the voting hours on Sundays to be from 1 p.m. to 9 p.m., which is a direct strike at what's called the souls to the polls efforts that a lot of churches in Black communities especially use to get people to take straight from church service to the polling station. And I think it was State Representative Travis Clardy is his name, out of Nacogdoches, and he tried to claim that it's actually supposed to be 11 a.m., not 1 p.m. and it was just merely a clerical error, and that there wasn't any kind of malintent there involved. But you were getting at something there, especially when you're talking about that. It sounds like Texas Democrats were willing to, or at least in the position where they're going to have to really take, a difficult loss here, but be able to claim, hey, at least we were able to get some of these provisions taken out. But the Republicans wanted to push things even further, which of course has been a theme of this entire legislative session, and really what led to this in the first place. If you don't mind sharing, I know that you mentioned before we started recording that you also you'd heard whispers of this happening and that there was kind of varied opinions on this. But obviously, people and lawmakers were pushed to the position where they felt like they had no other choice but to walk out.
Yeah, and I really want to go back to your point about this claim about the souls to the polls, just a clerical error, and I want to prove that that's not the case. I watched the debate, and first of all, the souls to the polls conversation is about a traditional African American effort to get voters to the poll on the last Sunday of early voting.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially what happens is people go to church in the morning, and then after that, everybody kind of caravans to the polls and goes to vote. So what this bill did was move the starting date for voting on Sunday to 1 p.m. instead of where it traditionally had been, which was earlier, to give people time in the morning to go vote on Sunday. Now, as you mentioned, Clardy said this was just a typo where it said 11. It should have said, or where it said 1 as in 1 p.m., it should have said 11. So he's trying to claim that there was 1 there and there should have been 2 1s there. That would have been 11. Now, that obviously doesn't account for the fact that it said 1 p.m.
That's right.
And if it really meant it was supposed to be 11 and there was just a 1 missing, then it would have actually said 1 a.m. And so that was just a lie. And I have more proof here that it was a lie because, first of all, no, while this entire conversation took place on the floor of the Senate, it was never brought up by any Republican that, oh no, that was just a mistake. In fact, they argued on why that should have been why 1 p.m. was the right time to start. And basically Brian Hughes, who was the Senate author of the bill, basically argued that people who work the polls also need to go to church, and so we need to let them go to church. Now, obviously, people go to church at all different times on different days, depending on their religion. But it was just a very poor excuse. And I just want to play this 30-second clip of an exchange between Royce West, who is the African-American senator from Dallas, and Brian Hughes, who's the Senate sponsor of this bill. Take a listen to this.
Those persons that are involved in those souls to the polls, by 5, 6 o'clock, it's over with, okay? Because they start early. And by doing this, you inhibit the ability to have those types of programs to run the length of time that they normally would, early in the morning till the afternoon. This particular language.
Again, I'll defer to you, Senator, but again, we're going from a minimum 5 hours to a minimum 6 hours. So the counties are required to get more time. And respectfully, I believe the intent was to keep this a Sunday afternoon activity. I don't think the intent was to keep anybody from.
Did you talk to them?
Now, you see there, he said the intent of the bill was to keep this an afternoon activity. It was not an accident. It was the intent of the bill to prevent people from voting in the morning. And so now they get busted on this and they try to claim it was a clerical error. And so that, to me, it just really strikes at the heart of the intent of the entire bill.
You're right. And it speaks to the more, the most bald-faced, attempts to not even really try to come up with any kind of excuse or way to really rationalize their actions in a way that anyone who's paying attention would buy, right? And obviously there's a number of reasons for that in terms of how, where the Republican Party is headed and has been headed for a long time in America and in Texas, especially in many ways. And it speaks to, obviously the majorities they have in both the House and the Senate chambers. but it also, it just shows that they weren't expecting any type of real formidable challenge from Democrats. So again, I guess as we can talk about, Democrats breaking quorum isn't entirely unprecedented as they did it in 2003, but to do it in this fashion, it is still drawing national attention and hopefully will continue to pick up steam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the speaker is going to take a lot of flack for this. He's going to continue to take it from all sides. But let's be clear: in 2003, the House fled. Essentially, they broke the quorum and they went to Ardmore, Oklahoma, and the Senate then they basically took turns. Right, it took like 3 sessions, special sessions in 2003 to get redistricting at the time passed through. And this was mid-decade redistricting. It was unprecedented. We all know of the census every 10 years, and redistricting follows that. Well, Tom DeLay, seeking more Republicans in U.S. Congress, came to Texas and said, we're going to do mid-decade redistricting. He later ended up going to jail. We all know Tom DeLay. But he essentially came to Texas to ram through redistricting, mid-decade redistricting, to get more Republicans to Congress. In order to stop that, Democrats in the House went to Ardmore, Oklahoma, one session, and they broke that quorum for that session. Then they called another special session, and then senators went to New Mexico and basically broke quorum. And so it was kind of this trade-off. But the reason they fled is because there was a threat of DPS officers arresting all of the members who were breaking quorum, that they were going to drag them back to their chamber and force them to be present, whether they voted or not. That the quorum simply has to exist for the vote to take place. So essentially they fled. And in this case, Democrats did not have to leave the state because the speaker basically said, it's your choice to leave or not. And I'm not going to arrest you. I'm not going to send DPS after you to do that. And he took a lot of heat from his own party, from Dan Patrick and from the governor for that. They're not very pleased with him. But that's his choice. And I think what we really need to pay attention to now, because the narrative has been obviously Democrat versus Republican, but I think the bigger sort of story in some ways, the inside story, is the sort of beef that is forming between the speaker, the Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, and Governor Abbott. And this is all of the same party, and yet there's a lot of tension brewing between them that could definitely affect what legislation is passed in special session. So as Democrats try to find what leverage they have, some of that leverage is going to be literally the fact that the speaker and the lieutenant governor aren't even talking to each other, right? And they're the leaders of the opposite chambers that have to work together to get this legislation passed. And if we'll remember back to 2017, when the trans bathroom bill was the big deal, it was put on a special session call. This was a Dan Patrick priority. It was put on this special session call. Joe Strauss and the Texas House did not pass that bill in special session. And so that just shows that, yes, Democrats don't have the numbers, but there's not, I will say it this way, there is tension to be exploited between members of the Republican Party. And from what I understand from insiders and things like that, the governor and the lieutenant governor are not on speaking terms. And the lieutenant governor and the speaker are not on speaking terms. And it seems like Abbott and the speaker basically still have a working relationship. However, the governor's response to what happened could put more tension there as well, because you've probably seen that the governor has essentially, his response was to threaten to defund the legislature altogether by vetoing Article 10 of the budget. Now, Article 10 of the budget does fund the legislature, which isn't just their per diems and their salary, their big $7,200 a year salaries, but it's also staff, right? It's all the people working at the Capitol to do all this work. And it's also the legislative budget board. It's all the attorneys that work on to figure out how you write this policy. Is it even legal? Is it constitutional? And so it's a kind of a nuclear bomb that the governor has essentially threatened to drop. And also, I don't know. He's claiming it's because they didn't show up to work, but I've never known threatening somebody's pay as being a good incentive for them to show up for work. I mean, if you're telling me you're not going to pay me, and I'm definitely not going to show up for work. But it's not even clear that he can do this. It's not clear how it would work. And it's certainly authoritarian for one branch of the government to say, I'm going to defund a whole nother branch of the government because they're not doing what I want them to do. And so I think that it was ham-handed. I think it was clumsy. I think it's not even legal what he's claiming to do here. And it just shows, as you've said multiple times here, they don't know what to do when they face real adversity. They're not prepared for it. They've never really experienced it. And we're seeing how clumsily they handle it.
You're right. You're right. And we can get into a little bit here about what this means for the upcoming special session. I know they haven't announced when it will be yet. But it speaks to one, as you mentioned, just a completely unorganized and at odds Texas Republican Party. And I think just, the larger trend, then I know that this is more than just from within the Senate, as you were just laying out there, but it really speaks to, Dan Patrick, for all that he poses to Texans and all of the kind of really, for lack of a better phrase, maniacal things he tries to push through. It really speaks to his true limitations as a legislator, right? He's had a number of parties. You just mentioned in 2017. We're talking about, now in terms of some of his main priorities pushing through, and he's not even on speaking terms with the person who's supposed to be his partner, right? I mean, I think that really just shows that when push comes to shove, relationships do, come into play at some point in time, and it's not surprising when you think about who Dan Patrick is, but it just, again, it really just shows that the guy can't always put the rubber to the road whenever he really needs to do so. And it's an indictment on him personally, I think that.
Yeah, and the governor himself, because this is their agenda. They control the entire government and they can't get it done. They can't keep the lights on and they can't keep the government working. I mean, this is a huge indictment, as you said. And so the governor has nobody else to blame but himself, really, truly. And so I was there at on midnight when the Democrats held their press conference after they walked out, and I've got some, pretty good pictures and some just good little tidbits and quotes from the members that were speaking there. Primarily those who spoke. I think I saw Nicole Collier speaking when I walked up, but I could not hear her. So by the time I had walked up, they had already started, and it was the caucus chair, Chris Turner, who was speaking about why they did it, and it was some of the things that we already went over, that they were prepared to speak this thing dead until it became clear that they weren't going to be allowed to speak, and then they took the only route that they could. And so the question naturally from the journalists in the audience was, well, what now? They're only going to come back with a worse bill. Did you shoot yourself in the foot by doing this or whatever? But of course the answer is no. You have to fight, and we fought, and we see how they react, and we see the new situation we're in. It's a new day. We live to fight again. We will use every tool in the toolbox to kill this bill. That's what Chairman Turner said, and I believe that's exactly what they're going to do. They can always break quorum again if they feel like they have to do that. There are lots of things that they can try to do to raise awareness of this issue nationally, and I think that is going to be one of the best things that come out for Democrats and for the voters of Texas, is that this is not a partisan issue. This is an issue that is broadly supported by most people, regardless of the party affiliation, that they want their vote to count, and that they want government to not make it harder for them to hold government accountable. And this seems like an issue conservatives would be a part of, and I think it's not in this case, because Republicans see themselves losing power cycle after cycle after cycle, and now they're trying to use this sort of nuclear option to hold on to their power. And So, TMF, Trey Martinez Fisher, who is a member from San Antonio, who is really known for his basically his own parliamentary chops on the floor, basically is well known for killing bills, coming up with points of order, using very good strategy to delay and kill bills. When he spoke, he essentially said, he spoke directly to President Biden and said, we need a national response for federal voting rights because of what's happening here in Texas. And we need the Congress to step up and pass the new voting rights bill in order to protect voters' rights across this country, but right here and right now in Texas, in the biggest state that is facing this threat. And so I think this is a huge opportunity for Democrats because now we have months to organize. We have months to raise awareness, raise money, and organize on behalf of all Texans. And again, it's not a hyper-partisan issue. So it's a really great one for us. And it's just a huge opportunity.
Yeah. And right. In an ideal world, things would have gone a little differently in November. We could have maybe taken back the Texas House, but that isn't what happened. And so sometimes you have to just be able to make the best of a really difficult situation. And there is no better situation than shining a spotlight on what these voting bills, as well as a number of other things that the Republicans are currently trying to push through, due to Texans across the state, regardless of who they support, right? The idea of stripping away voting rights, that's what you were talking about. It's not just antithetical to our democracy, it's a threat to that democracy. So that's all you can really do is shine a spotlight on that, make sure that these bills don't, just get, written, behind the scenes and passed at midnight. Because if these, lawmakers are going to continue to try to strip away power from the people, you have to do everything you can, not just to fight it, but to make sure that everyone can see it, that they're doing it in the light of day. If they have the audacity to claim that a intentional strategy of when you're dictating voting hours on a Sunday is a typo, make sure that they're saying that so everyone's watching and they can't do it in the dark of night.
Yeah, and that's the irony of they voted in the middle of the night to prevent people from voting at night, I think was not lost on a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so why would they do that, and how obviously hypocritical that is. And so yeah, it's just simply a lack of transparency. They don't want people to see what they're doing. They're embarrassed about what they're doing, but they also know it's the only last thing that they can do, because when they're pushing things like you brought up this list of bills that have passed and bills that have failed, but it includes things that are highly unpopular, taking away reproductive rights, allowing anyone to carry a gun without any type of training or record or ID is not popular. And so in order for them to keep satiating their base, they have to shrink the electorate. And so that is clearly what the goal is. And in order to do that, they have to go back to the old playbook of targeting people of color because they tend to vote for Democrats. And it's sad, but that's where we are right now in the state of Texas. And so, we don't know, as you mentioned, when this bill will be taken up on special session, but we presume, I will say, that it will be in the fall and put on the same special session call as redistricting. And I think that would be another good thing for Democrats, because it will give us more time to sort of negotiate and to delay, because redistricting won't be an easy thing. Redistricting is going to be a knockout, drag out, hard fought issue. Again, you referenced before that we left and broke quorum before on this issue alone. And so to have both these issues come up, they're just going to highlight that, again, Republicans trying to change the rules to benefit their party and keep power. And that's all redistricting is going to be about. That's all the SB7 is going to be about. On one hand, Republicans trying to choose, legislators, politicians trying to choose their voters through redistricting. And on the other hand, limit who can actually show up through SB7. So for them, it's a great package that can allow them to hold on to power. For us, it's a great organizing opportunity and a way to show what they are doing. Because if they thought their ideas were popular, they wouldn't have to do this.
Right. And as you're talking about trying to buy time and make this, a national issue, that really also underscores which is what they've been trying to really send a message to the Biden administration about, is if you pass, which is sitting in the Senate right now, if you pass the For the People Act, that will address a variety of these measures that Republicans are trying to institute, but including redistricting, right? You have to pass, all redistricting efforts would have to be verified by an independent commission, which would of course thwart, just a multitude of ways in which you're going to disenfranchise Democratic voters otherwise in Texas. And not to get too caught up in the slog of things here, but I think it's worth mentioning even several of the other bills that were also passed. Right, you're talking about banning pubs from closing churches during national disaster emergencies, and that's directly because churches were ordered to close during the COVID-19 pandemic. So if that were to happen again, theoretically, public officials would not be able to stop that from happening. The winter storm response, which it ordered power plants to be weatherized, but it didn't make any wholesale changes to Texas's power system, to ERCOT, any of those things, right? I mean, really heading into the session, there were two big things that the Texas legislature need
the
to
only
address.
things they should have been focused on, right?
COVID-19 and our energy sources.
Yeah, and even in the ERCOT bill that you referenced, it's put the expense on Texans, not on those companies. And I think that is, the corporate welfare there needs to be called out, because that's a big deal.
Yeah, and even there are the number of these quote unquote back the blue laws, including one that the governor signed into law, that would withhold revenue for cities over 250,000 people who quote unquote defunded the police. I'm not sure how they defined defunding, but it's obviously directed at a place like Austin. So there's this sentiment of, we're backing police, and yet, right, all various forms of police commissions, chiefs and such came out and spoke out against permitless carry and said that this is going to be a danger. But of course, that doesn't matter then.
They spoke out against permitless carry, and then the entire Republican Party opposed the bipartisan investigation into the death of a Capitol police officer on January 6th. They didn't want to hear about what led up to that and how that, and the guy, his mother was on, the halls of Congress, begging them to support this commission so that they could find out what really happened here. And Democrats were going to put an equal number of Republicans on the commission, and Republicans said, we don't want any part of it. So we're going to still go through and we're going to find out what happened. It'll just be Democrats looking into it, and that's really sad for our country. But it's certainly an indication of the fact that the quote back to blue narrative is just a political talking point and nothing more.
Right. That's right. And Joe, I know you were talking about how there's a number of different options that Democratic lawmakers here in Texas, a number of different tools they still have left in their toolbox for an upcoming, we don't know when, but an upcoming special session, including breaking quorum again. How viable of an option is that? Is there a circumstance that you think that Republicans may end up saying, hey, like, we will bring in DPS, or where do you think things go from there? Should that be deployed again?
Well, again, because of the tension between the different chambers, the sort of battle lines are forming almost as much as Democrat versus Republican. It's forming House versus Senate versus the governor. And so Phelan, who apparently was concerned about his speakership if he were to not send the DPS after Democrats and essentially allow Democrats to break the quorum, he was very concerned about that there might be, Republicans in the House may, call for a speaker vote essentially and basically kick him out, right? Like essentially a recall of the speaker because of that. Now, because of the way the governor and the lieutenant governor treated the House, he was able to rally the members of the House. because Dan Patrick basically said, the House has no control over their members, and they're all letting all this conservative legislation die. And then Abbott was basically saying the same thing whenever in that speech. Dan Patrick is saying things like, the governor needs to do an immediate special session to cover these conservative issues, and then Speaker Phelan essentially was able to rally the House together against the Senate, and not necessarily against the Democrats, but to say, wait a minute, Dan Patrick, we sent more bills to the Senate that we passed in the House that were never heard in the Senate. We heard 99% of the Senate bills that you sent to the House. 99% of them went to a committee, and 90% of them were heard in a committee, and we voted out far more Senate bills than you did House bills. So who was really doing the work, and who was really sitting on their hands not doing the work? And so the fight is now going back and forth, the House and the Senate. And the more Democrats can leverage that, and the more Democrats can put pressure on these members to do the right thing, and to, even if they claim this was a mistake, oh, that was also a mistake, this was a typo, every time we get them to acknowledge one of those things, we improve our chances. We improve the bill, or we make the bill less bad, less egregious. And so these are just some of the things that we can do to just keep the pressure on. And I do think that there's an opportunity where it becomes to it that Democrats will break quorum again.
Just have to, as you're talking about, just underscore that beyond being undemocratic, beyond not trying to do anything to improve Texans' lives, these lawmakers are ineffective. They don't know how to pull the levers of government and ensure that government runs smoothly, because there's already enough roadblocks, intentional roadblocks in our political system as it is. So the idea that you don't have people in place who are navigating it or are incapable of doing so, despite being in these positions for a number of years at this point, is just really telling, right? And also, I think there has to be the idea of, you pair that with the fact that you have Sid Miller, Alan West, Louis Gohmert, all attending, a QAnon affiliated conference in Dallas just a few days ago, in which the idea of a military coup was openly embraced by disgraced General Michael Flynn. Mm-hmm. So you have to be able to marry these two ideas, and that these people are ineffective. They're going after your rights, and they are getting increasingly extreme in their ideology.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all part of the same program. And Donald Trump is clearly still at the helm of this party. And just in the last few days, we saw him endorse Governor Greg Abbott for re-election. Supposedly today, George P. Bush is going to make an announcement, and then Donald Trump is going to make an endorsement in that race against Ken Paxton versus George P. Bush for Attorney General. Trump has already endorsed Dan Patrick for re-election. So this is very much still Trump's party, and he's still upset that he lost this election. The rumors are now that he thinks he's going to be reinstated somehow into the government based on some things Sidney Powell said. So yeah, no, these are a bunch of like kooks at this point that are running a national party, and that is running now Texas. We've got to wake up, and we've got to get people registered to vote. We've got to get people educated on the issues and what's happening for their own rights, and then they can choose who they want to vote for. But right now, their right to vote is in the balance, and so very much still Trump's party, and the big lie about the election is very much tied to the voter suppression, bills that we're seeing right now that they're trying to push through.
You're right, and I, like many people, after the November 2020 election, I turned those push notifications off from New York Times. Right, I was like, okay, I can breathe, and I know I'm not alone in that thinking, but I do realize, and I think that we all need to realize that the work is only just beginning, right? Because the blowback that has been coming in the form of these bills from Republicans in Texas and Georgia and Florida, all over the country, are really starting to mount. And so now is the time that we have to kind of catch our breath and say, all right, let's get back to work, because there are only going to be more and more opportunities to continue trying to assert ourselves, and we need to do so.
Mm-hmm. And so with that, all I can say to everybody listening out there is to stay tuned to the Texas Signal and keep following TexasSignal.com, because we will continue to keep you in the loop, informed, and let you know what you can do to make sure that your rights are preserved. And we want to give a special thanks to our Patreons who ensure that this type of progressive journalism can continue in the state of Texas. It's so badly needed, never more than right now. And so thank you so much. Please continue to join the conversation. We're on every social media platform that I know of. We're on TikTok now, and Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And so, please reach out to us, stay in touch. We'd love to hear from you. And thanks again. And so until next time, we will have another update very soon. As soon as we figure out what's going on, me and Dave will be right back here to let you know and keep you in the loop.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. It's there's never a dull moment, is there?
No, unfortunately, no. I take some dull moments these days, but
yeah.
Okay. Well, until next time, y'all. Later.